Hello and welcome. I'm David Robinson, the online editor at The Banker, and today we're going to look at the huge shadow banking sector in China. Kim, the shadow banking sector in China is estimated to be worth about 13 trillion US and is a massive part of the economy. Just to provide some framework for this discussion, how should we view shadow banking? How should we define it?
Well, I think previously the idea of shadow banking was that it was very kind of covert and, as the name implies, it was very in the shadows. But actually, it's a lot more transparent than that now. It's really what is taking place away from the kind of the government run, the government backed banks, like the big banks. So what you're seeing is the kind of services like the peer-to-peer lending space and also the online lenders, such as like the payment platforms like WeChat Pay and Alipay. They both provide lending facilities. So it's really quite well known by really well established organizations, but because they're not coming under the same level of regulation as is seen by the top banks in China, they're considered to be the shadow banking space. And because they haven't got the same level of oversight, they're considered to be a little bit more suspect, I suppose, in some ways, to what is actually happening within the main banks themselves.
Well, thank you. That's helpful. Now, there's been talk about regulating the shadow banking sector in China for some time, but there's been some big changes now. Is it happening in a big way now?
Yeah, so I think with like the above mentioned online lenders, like there's been a lot of change that's happened in there really recently. Like these companies are just huge now, and the regulator really wants to have a better oversight of what they're doing. And say, for the example, the P2P space, that is actually pretty much overruled now in China. Like it's not allowed to operate anymore because of the concerns around not only the financial risk, but also kind of the societal risk as well, of operating kind of that like lending platform. But the regulators now are really trying to crack down in a lot of ways on these companies and to get that greater oversight of what is actually happening. And they're starting to introduce more rules and regulations now as well, including how much the online micro lenders are allowed to lend to customers, and that they actually have to hold some funds themselves as well. Whereas previously they would take funds from smaller and the more regional rural banks. They would use them as a kind of conduit for the lending, but now they're actually having to hold the funds themselves. So it's a real change in how these operations are being run, and it's giving the regulator greater oversight of what's actually happening across this part of the sector.
Because it's quite a delicate task to regulate the shadow banking sector because it's huge and you don't want to cut off or mess around with such a key source of finance too much.
Yeah, and that's a real issue because in a lot of ways, the shadow banking sector is a necessary part of the Chinese economy because a lot of these borrowers, they just can't get the funds from the traditional banks because of the risk appetite that these banks have. They will generally look to lend to the government-backed agencies, the government-backed companies, because they know there's a very low risk attached to that, because if anything goes wrong, the government will step in and will back these companies. But the smaller private companies, they can really struggle to actually access financing that they need. And this goes from kind of like the smaller, like, but still quite large organizations, right the way through to just the, street sellers. They would never get working capital financing from a bank, so they can borrow some money through WeChat Pay, for example, and then finance what they need, their operational costs in that way. So it's a really essential part of the economy. It's not something that I think the government or the regulator is looking to completely eradicate because they know how essential it is. But what they really want is to just have that greater level of oversight and some greater levels of control so that these forms of platforms don't really grow exponentially.
And in light of this deeper regulation, might the shadow banking sector continue to decrease in size over the next few years?
Yeah, I think it's going to be kind of a managed decline. There's still 85 trillion RMB worth of assets within the shadow banking space. So it's still a huge sector, but there's really the goal to kind of move more into the kind of legitimate banking space. And there are more rules around now that these banks do actually have to lend to smaller companies and to SMEs. So there's an incentive there for them to provide this financing and also for these customers to move away from the shadow banking space and to move into these more traditional banking organizations in order to get their funds. But I think overall, it's, the Chinese government has very strong goals on what they want to achieve in terms of the economy, and they will not cut off this financing source because it will strangle these economies and it will not allow these companies to help contribute to the GDP goals that the country has.
Well, Kim, thank you. It's a big issue and one that won't go away anytime soon, and we should continue to keep monitoring on the banker. Thank you very much.
Thank you.